very happy to introduce Maryann Bylander today. She's the Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Lewis and Clark College. Her 2012 PhD is in Sociology from the University of Texas, and after that she spent several years as a fellow in the Department of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And then she went on to Lewis and Clark, which is in Portland, Oregon. I'd hoped to invite Maryann to campus a couple of years ago when she was collaborating on a project with our own PhD student, Nathan Green, at that time. But she had a very happy interruption in plans in the form of a new baby. So it's nice to finally have her on campus. And we appreciate you coming. I know this is a hard time for parents of young children to travel. I first discovered Maryann's work a number of years ago when I was working for the first time in a rural village in Siem Reap province, which is the second poorest province in Cambodia. And I was in a village that was not far from the Thai border. And I was walking around the village, and I soon discovered that it was a community of predominantly elder people and children. There were no young people there, no parents in sight. And I found out that they were in Thailand. They had all left the village. And so this, of course, made me realize that there was so much I didn't know about rural village life. And so I turned to her work on migration to help me begin to understand that phenomenon. Her many publications examine the intersections between migration, land dispossession, gender, rural livelihoods, environment, microfinance, and indebtedness. Her work is published in many different journals, scholarly journals, and I just learned from Ian and Maryann that many of them are development-oriented journals. Sociology of Development, Development and Change, Geoforum, Population Research and Policy Review, and Journal of Migration and Human Security. So those are a few of the places where she's published most recently. Maryann has also worked in the field of development. I know that will be of interest to many people here. She was a founding board member and managing director of an organization called PEPI, a youth empowerment and education NGO based in Siem Reap province, which is also where Sarak Rit has been working for the past like 10 years or so. Before that, she worked at the Asian University for Women in Chittagong, Bangladesh, as well as the NGO Education Partnership in Phnom Penh, and she's been a consultant for the World Bank, Oxfam, and other NGOs. Maryann has a significant track record of public-facing interviews and citations in newspapers, magazines, and development publications, which I just want to point out. From The Economist most recently to the Bangkok Post and VOA Cambodia. She joins us today after having recently held a very coveted 2021 National Endowment for Humanities Summer Fellowship, as well as a 2020 Center for Khmer Studies Research Fellowship for her work on debt and borrowing during COVID. Her talk today is focused on her new book, In Progress, which will be done soon, which centers on migration issues in Cambodia. So welcome, Maryann.
Thank you. My gosh, that was the most extensive and correct introduction that I've ever had. I'm very impressed with your research. So first of all, I just want to thank Anne and Ian and everyone at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies for inviting me here today. It's my first COVID era presentation in person, and it's really nice to be able to share this work. My talk today is part of a broader book project that I'm just finishing up while on sabbatical, and it's tentatively called Precarious Documents, Precarious Debts, Contesting Safe Migration in Southeast Asia. And it's based on fieldwork that I conducted in Cambodia and in Thailand several years ago, 2017, 2018. So this is a decidedly pre-COVID era project. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book before I begin speaking to a more specific issue. So the book is primarily about the limits of legal status, or maybe I should say the trade-offs of legal status for migrant workers in Southeast Asia. In the global north, many of us think of legal status as singularly beneficial for migrant workers, and researchers have consistently demonstrated that this is true. Both in the US and elsewhere, it's known that legal status is a key dimension of security for migrant workers. Undocumented workers consistently earn less and experience more job precarity than those with legal status. Disadvantage persists outside the workplace in kind of every area imaginable: access to healthcare, stigma, fear, barriers to education, etc. The protective nature of legal status is much more contestable in other parts of the world, and this is particularly true, I argue, in Thailand, where legal status is associated with controls and costs, but not always rights and protections. For Cambodians seeking work in Thailand, and many of them do, the most state-sanctioned forms of migration, which I'll call regular migration, or moving through regular channels, that means legal, state-sanctioned movement. These kinds of channels are the most costly and the most restrictive. They produce time-bound contracts where migrants are effectively prohibited from changing jobs and where they can't move alongside family members or trusted friends. In addition, labor protections in Thailand are poorly regulated, and even migrants who have moved through these state-sanctioned regular channels experience contract substitution, doing work they didn't agree to, deceit, labor law violations, dangerous working conditions, and harassment and abuse. In fact, the high costs and the limited benefits of moving through legal channels are the reason why so many migrants move through other routes, crossing the border clandestinely with brokers or following friends or family. In addition, Thailand offers ongoing regularization opportunities to gain legal status for people who have moved across the border without authorization. I argue in the book that these regularization campaigns, which we think of as maybe progressive in that they bring migrants into the legal system, are actually similarly double-edged. Documentation itself is precarious. It can be easily invalidated due to the way that legal status is defined in Thailand and the cost of maintaining status, and it's subject to an ad hoc, consistently changing regime of migration management. The documents that come with regularization also come at a tremendous financial cost, producing new debts that are sometimes tied back to household land in Cambodia. That creates new forms of transnational risk. At the same time, these documents put migrants into new relations of dependency with the Thai state, with the Cambodian state, with brokers, and with their employers. Together, this can lead to less mobility, less autonomy to change jobs, and greater costs for everything from housing and utilities to trips home. So the book argues that both the act of moving through regular or legal channels and the act of obtaining legal status produce mixed outcomes. These actions can offer protection against deportation and sometimes offer other forms of benefits and protections, but this isn't consistently the case. So much of the work kind of focuses on migrant experiences. It juxtaposes the kind of experiences of Cambodians who have moved through these more regular channels versus those who didn't. And it follows people who, as they move through regularization processes in Thailand, which we might expect to produce beneficial outcomes. Ultimately, the book argues that while more and more migrants are gaining legal status, they're not gaining the rights, freedoms, and benefits that we expect from it. Legal status in this context doesn't necessarily lead to better working conditions, more successful migrations, or the ability to challenge exploitive working conditions. Yet it does produce these new costs, new debts, and new dependencies. And this matters because while migrants don't necessarily view legalization or regularization as beneficial, sometimes they don't view it as beneficial at all, it's actually more and more requisite in order to work in Thailand now. So one of the defining features of the Cambodia-Thai system is that over the past decade, it shifted from a largely informal migration system to one where it's much harder to exist outside of that informal structure. In this sense, so here the book engages with arguments that describe how intensifying forms of migration infrastructure, and particularly those related to documentation, actually make migrants more legible to the state, submitting them to new forms of state control. In this sense, even regularization and documentation that seems outwardly progressive can serve the needs of states more than it serves the needs of migrants. So these are kind of the key arguments of the book, but today I'm going to treat them as largely background information so that I can talk about a second and related set of arguments, which are really talking about the Cambodian development sector, which many of you have some familiarity with, and particularly the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and international organizations that are working in the area of so-called safe migration. If any of you have spent time in Cambodia recently, and I know at least some of you have, you may have come across these safe migration programs, as many NGOs now engage with them as part of their work. So in 2017, when I conducted my field work, all of these organizations, most of these are NGOs, but we also have the International Labor Organization and the International Organization for Migration, operated large safe migration programs in Cambodia. The vast majority of these programs were relatively new. They had started in the past decade. The rise of safe migration programming in the region is kind of explained by many things, some of them global and some of them a little bit more regional. For those interested, Sverre Moland, I don't know if any of you are familiar with his work, but he has a recently published book that explores the rise of these programs in Southeast Asia, and it's excellent. For now, let me just tell you a little bit about the kind of dynamics that are most important in explaining the ascendancy of safe migration. At the global level, we can see this most clearly in a set of kind of global development discourses that begin to really privilege the idea of migration management and improved migration management as a key strategy for development. So many of you will know what this picture is. It's the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals put out by the UN. Goal number 10 relates to reduced inequality. And part of that goal is really specifically about improving responsible and well-managed migration policies. When they talk about responsible and well-managed migration policies, they use a very specific language. They talk about safe, regular, and orderly migration. And it's this framing that we begin to see over and over again at the level of global development discourse, the kind of coupling of those terms, which presume that safety arises alongside more regular and orderly forms of migration. And again, when I use that term regular migration, I just mean legal migration, state-sanctioned migration. That same language is reproduced exactly in the Global Compact on Migration, the Global Compact for Migration, which was drafted in 2018. And in its final form, this isn't its title. Its title is the Global Compact for Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration. So it actually incorporated that language explicitly into its title. Together, these global discourses have normalized and really globalized the idea that migration management is in fact a development goal, and set out a discourse assuming that migration will be safer and more beneficial if it takes place through these particular channels. That global discourse then shapes funding opportunities and the kind of programming that international organizations and NGOs engage with. There are also more regionally specific ways to understand the rise of safe migration, and again, Moland's work explains this in quite a bit of detail, suggesting that safe migration programming has arisen out of the loss of momentum of anti-trafficking programs in the region. That those anti-trafficking programs, which focus rather narrowly on exploitation, have received a lot of critique, both externally and kind of from actors internal, and that the result has been kind of an expansion of the way in which they think about safety and migration processes, thus safe migration. This is a compelling explanation in the Cambodian context as well. But I think there's an even more basic one, which is just that migration has grown increasingly significant for many rural communities, not just in border sending, traditional border areas, historical migration areas, but also in areas much further afield. So NGOs working in these areas where they see migration kind of becoming more important and common are kind of seeking to address it in a way that makes sense, and the language of safe migration and the kind of programming that's already put out there by global development actors is what they kind of attach to. The proliferation of safe migration has produced an array of diverse interventions, and all of these together seek to kind of manage and shape the cross-border movements that Cambodians have been enacting on their own for decades. These programs fund young people to put on dramas about the dangers of irregular migration. They set up point people in rural villages and migrant resource centers in provinces where there are a lot of where there are historically strong migrant networks. They create pre-departure programs and codes of conduct for legal recruitment agencies to improve regular migration. They implement livelihood programs in migrant sending areas, presumably to ensure that unwanted migrations don't take place. They create working groups to improve migration policy. And across all of these interventions, they engage in education campaigns about the dangers of irregular movement, moving outside of legal channels, and the benefits of doing so through legal recruitment agencies. And this is important. While these organizations have understandings of safety that are quite different from one another, and they think about development in different ways, safe migration programs really do cohere around an idea that irregular migration is less beneficial, less secure, less safe, going to create this set of dangers and risks, while regular migration moving through legal channels is inherently more safe and more beneficial. And it's in part this claim, which I've already suggested I see as quite contestable in the Southeast Asian context, that creates fertile ground for what I'm going to call today the spectacle of safe migration. I should note that I chose to present this piece of the book because it's the most in progress, so I'm really looking forward to your ideas and your feedback. This is the kind of definition that I'm playing with right now. The spectacle of safe migration as being a set of practices and performances that allow development actors to appear to be working in support of migrant workers while naturalizing and in some cases enabling the kinds of restrictive labor and documentation regimes that are at the root of migrant troubles. Probably needs to get a little more concise than that. So this is an ethnographic project, and I'd like to spend most of my day sharing stories rather than describing abstract ideas. So I want to begin by taking you to the place where these ideas really became kind of important for me, where they began coming together, which is Poi Phet, Cambodia, so just on the Cambodia side of the Cambodia-Thai border, and to a place called the Migrant Assistance Center, or as I'll call it, the MAC, which serves as the official deportation center for Cambodians returning from Thailand. For a deportation center, the MAC was underwhelming. It sat in the middle of an open air but rarely used local market, just a few hundred kilometers from the Thai border, behind the newly constructed railroad tracks linking Cambodia and Thailand. It was really just a large barbed wire enclosure with doors on either side. Little about it felt coercive, nor did it really feel official. Inside the barbed wire enclosure were rows of blue plastic chairs, a few signboards, and a TV on a blue rolling stand. Behind the enclosure were 4 separate market stalls housing the various development partners that worked at the MAC. The primary partners, the International Organization for Migration and Samaritan's Purse, and half a dozen other local and international NGOs. Across the street were the government offices, the anti-trafficking police, and a small room serving as the office of the village chief. There was no sign to mark the space, just a worn Cambodian flag over the entrance of the barbed wire enclosure. Some of the NGO workers had proposed a sign saying, "Welcome to the MAC," but an immigration official objected. Welcome, she noted, suggests a space intended for fun or for tourists. The MAC was neither. Officially, the MAC was a government-run center, the designated place where Thai authorities returned unauthorized Cambodians that they had apprehended across the border. Yet while Cambodian authorities were present at the MAC, and ostensibly they were in charge of its work, it was conceived of, created by, and largely run by international and non-governmental organizations. It had just begun a few years prior to the beginning of my fieldwork in 2017. According to its NGO partners, the MAC's primary roles were to screen for victims of trafficking, collect data on migration dynamics, and educate returnees on safe migration. There was the assumption that migrants would be returning back to Thailand and they wanted them to go safely this time. On a typical day, somewhere between 50 and 200 Cambodians would pass through the MAC, making it a really ideal site for this kind of intervention. It was the only place where either government actors or NGOs had access to such a diverse set of returning migrant workers. Much of the day, very little happened at the MAC, but a few times a day, somewhere between 2 and 10, Thai police would send over a truck full of returned Cambodians. The truck looked like a moving jail with thick wire forming a grid across its middle section. Depending on the day, between 30 and 40 bodies were crammed inside each vehicle, and as the truck arrived, those inside would push their faces to the sides of the truck and cling to the wires. It was this image, bodies pressed behind bars, that local newspapers repeatedly used when writing about migration. The truck looked like it was locked, but it was only latched from the outside, with an opening above the latch that would allow anyone inside to open the door easily. The truck appeared more coercive than it was, an apt metaphor for the MAC itself. Technically, the MAC was a center that received deportees. The staff tracked the number of men, women, and children who moved through it each day, and it was these numbers that were used when the newspaper reported deportation statistics. But the word deported conjures a particular image of coercion. It is states that deport non-citizens, and they do so involuntarily. Contrary to other forms of migration, which usually involve a choice of when and how and where to move, Deportation is the form of migration that is most forcibly enacted upon an individual. One can't deport oneself, one can only be deported by the state, except for at the MAC. Let me explain what I mean. To be clear, everyone arriving on these trucks had been officially removed by the Thai government. They came from the Immigration Detention Center in Maryann Bylander, where migrants had their fingerprints taken and they were processed, and theoretically they were put on a blacklist so that they wouldn't be able to receive future work visas. They arrived in Phoi Phet with numbers written on their hands in black Sharpie from Thai police officers. Yet, as I learned on my first day observing deportation processes at the MAC, only a small fraction of those who came through here were deportees in the more traditional sense. Of the tens of thousands of migrants estimated to have passed through the MAC each year since it opened in 2015, only a minority were unwillingly removed by officers in Thailand. This is because for Cambodians without a passport, often the easiest and cheapest way of returning home was to be deported. Many returnees simply bought a bus ticket home in Thailand with the knowledge that at one of the checkpoints they would be returned through the MAC. Some even showed up on their own at the Sakao Immigration Center. Dropped off by motorbikes, they would walk into the facility and present themselves for deportation. It was a cheap trip home. Here we see the first signs of spectacle. The MAC's a site of deportation, but it's also a site where a much larger spectacle of deportation is produced. Many of those returning through the MAC are doing so on their own terms, to visit family and friends, to make a passport, to revalidate a tourist visa, or simply because they no longer wanted to work in Thailand. Yet in official statistics, they're treated as forcibly deported. This portrayal creates a particular vision of migration, one where deportation is widespread due to the dangers of irregular work abroad. And it's a portrayal that aligns well with the idea that irregular migration, moving without authorization, is unsafe, even if the experiences of migrants passing through the MAC don't always justify that idea. Once the trucks arrived at the MAC, a series of events would begin. The trucks honked as they pulled up the road adjacent to the MAC, and the market area burst into action. Taxi drivers would run up to the vehicle and unlatch the back and immediately begin hustling for potential fares. "Where are you going, brother? Siem Reap? Make sure to come with me. Look for me later." Young men, women, and children would tumble out the back of the truck, and they were directed by Cambodian immigration police into the barbed wire enclosure. It was a cage of sorts, but an airy, large one, and the doors on both sides remained open. If a returnee tried to avoid entering the space, the Thai police officer who drove the truck would bark harsh orders in Khmer and point him towards the cage. But Thai authority really ended with the truck, and for good reason, or if a returnee was insistent enough, that the Cambodian authorities would let them leave on their own. The MAC's enclosure was lined with blue plastic chairs with a wide aisle down the middle, women directed to one side and men to the other. Luggage from the truck was packed in a large stack in the center of the room. There were backpacks, suitcases, plastic bags, colorful rice bags, and often larger items: fans, televisions, wastebaskets, even refrigerators. The amount of luggage on the truck was a good indication of the level of desperation of those returning on it. Those who were truly deported by the state arrived with next to nothing. Those returning voluntarily often brought home multiple suitcases of belongings alongside larger items. The room itself was a microcosm of migration. In most trucks, a vast range of experiences were represented. There were construction workers, domestic workers, fishermen, cassava and sugarcane harvesters, market sellers, woodcutters, factory workers, street sweepers, and those not working at all. Some of those in the room had been in Thailand since they were children and struggled to speak Khmer. Others had been caught crossing the border that day. There were married couples, families, and solo men, women, and children of all ages. There were people with valid passports, people returning to make passports, and brokers organizing passport seekers. There were monks and young children in superhero costumes. Many people had been to the MAC before. One young man pointed to a carton of water bottles and said he'd been there as many times as there were bottles in the carton. After being seated, people purchased Cambodian SIM cards from the saleswomen who wandered through the aisles and exchanged Thai baht for Khmer Real. Many people immediately made calls or stared at their smartphones as Facebook updated them on the latest messages. Beggars often watched from outside the enclosure, soliciting donations from anyone who would match their gaze. Clearly, the deported were viewed as having something to give. Employees of the various NGOs moved like clockwork when the truck arrived, and they pulled on vests and brought out these cartons of water and snacks. As returnees were seated, the staff distributed these offerings along with USAID-funded brochures on how to migrate safely. The next hour or so was spent sharing official information on where and how to contact recruitment companies so people might return to Thailand legally, coupled with sensationalistic videos suggesting the risk of trafficking for migrants who didn't follow these instructions. At the MAC, the most consistent articulation of what it meant to migrate safely equated three distinct things: regular migration, crossing the border in a pre-planned way with a recruitment company; legal status, full documentation, and in this case that means a passport, visa, and a work permit; and a safer, more profitable migration experience. In this sense, the MAC's programming really resembled that of the broader development community. Safe migration is regular, orderly migration. This message was disseminated in various forms: information booklets handed out to migrants, long monologues that the staff would give to each truck, videos shown and produced by the IOM that were given at the MAC, and then informal conversations that anti-trafficking police, MAC staff, and local authorities had with returnees. I don't have time to share the entirety of the MAC's presentation, and you might find it a little boring, but I do want to illustrate the centrality of this understanding of safe migration by sharing the details of one of the videos shown at the MAC during this program to returnees. And it follows the conversation of two young Khmer women, friends, who run into each other at a local market in Cambodia. "Kuntia," a young woman cries as she sees her friend through the crowd. "I thought you were working in Thailand." Kuntia greets her friend and begins to describe her recent migration experience. She'd been recruited by an acquaintance for work at a shop in Thailand, and although she was excited to go, when she began her journey, nothing seemed to work out as planned. She paid $200 to cross the border illegally and get connected to an employer, but everything cost more than she expected. She was given someone else's documents, and then made to do difficult work in a rubber plantation, which was not what she had agreed to do. She was never paid for her labor and then was caught by police for holding fake documents. After spending a night in police custody, she returned back to Cambodia. She tells her friend, "I was extremely disappointed, but while we were at the Migration Information Center, the MAC, we received a lot of help from staff there. They gave us advice and information about how to migrate with proper documents. By doing so, this issue will not happen to us again." The video closed by saying, "Please think clearly and properly before you decide to migrate to a foreign country. If you want to migrate, remember that only legal migration can make you feel safe and receive benefits in that country." The video aligned with everything else shown, written, and seen at the MAC, saying the best way to ensure a safe, profitable, easy migration experiences was to move through the legal channel set up by the Cambodian government. What those at the MAC didn't say is that evidence to date actually doesn't suggest this is true at all. And here I'm not just referencing my own research that I kind of described at the beginning of this presentation. In fact, during my fieldwork, the IOM and the ILO produced a report called the Risks and Rewards Report, collecting data from over 1,800 migrants in the region, and it specifically sought to address the question of whether regular migration leads to more beneficial outcomes. The report's answer was no. Regular migration was not systematically associated with better outcomes, and nor should I say was documentation. Migrants who had gone through regular channels were in fact more likely to be doing work they hadn't agreed to do. They were more likely to experience harassment and abuse in their migration process. They were more likely to end up saddled with high costs they didn't expect, and as a result to have large debts. There wasn't even clear evidence that those with documents were better paid, and this was actually really striking. So while Kuntia's story might accurately represent the risks of those who move through brokers, those risks exist, it also represents the experiences of many people who move through regular legal channels. In fact, repeated qualitative studies of migrants in Thailand have noted that migrants are not just unaware of opportunities for regular migration, they actively reject them for these very reasons. So this is the second kind of spectacle we see at the MAC, a spectacle of education that misinforms migrants of the kinds of actions likely to produce safety and risk, and legitimizes the forms of legal movement supported by the Thai and Cambodian state, even when it's not clear that they are protective. There are also striking omissions from the MAC's program, which made it feel even more performative. In both the videos and in the MAC staff monologues, returnees were told that traveling across the border with legal recruitment agencies was the only path to legal status in Thailand. This was simply untrue. there were a number of routes to legal and quasi-legal status, many of which began only after the border had been crossed. In fact, during the time of my fieldwork, Thailand was enacting a national and widespread regularization campaign aimed at helping undocumented Cambodians alongside migrants from Laos and Myanmar to obtain legal status. It was much more common, cheaper, and easier for migrants employed in Thailand to gain status through regularization than it was to migrate through regular channels. And this is a picture of just a single set of people going through the regularization process in Bangkok. When I asked Rati, one of the MAC staff, not his real name, about this omission, he responded, "Real life is not like the rules." He put his hands together and waved them back and forth like a snake to highlight the circuitous way that things worked in practice. Employees at the MAC, which was a government-managed space, were only allowed to give information that conformed to Cambodian labor migration policy. And according to the Cambodian state, the only way to migrate legally was to go through the recruitment agencies that they had certified. So the MAC's NGO partners were required to say that the only way to work in Thailand was this, even if that wasn't actually true. This also limited the useful advice MAC workers could give migrants. Many of those coming through the MAC were actually in various stages of navigating regularization, and they had problems with it. They wanted help. But regularization wasn't mentioned as a possibility, and MAC workers couldn't give advice on navigating it or help with that process. They treated the most common path for Cambodians to gain legal status in Thailand as if it didn't exist. Rati found this frustrating. He shared with me he thought it was actually better for most people to migrate without documents and then to go through the regularization process in Thailand. This, of course, was a direct contradiction to his program, where his team explicitly suggested the benefits of going with legal recruiters. He told me, quote, "It works better when recruitment agencies aren't in charge of the process." This is one of the many recruitment agencies that are certified by the Cambodian government. Rati's primary concern with recruitment agencies was that they rarely allowed migrants to change jobs, despite the fact that migrants were often told this was possible. He shared, quote, "Recruitment agencies say that if a migrant wants to change employers, they can, but in reality, it's in the Thai hands. If the reason doesn't relate to their contract, there's nothing they can do. The Ministry of Labor and recruitment agencies are the only ones who can provide legal aid to workers, but they don't always do their job well," end quote. This wasn't just Rati's opinion. It was actually much harder for migrants to change jobs if they began their migration process in Cambodia with their recruitment agencies, who organized migration by the terms of the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, set up by the Cambodian and Thai governments. Under MOU migration, migrants could only change employers if they could prove that employers did one of 5 things: physically assault them, not pay minimum wage, engage in wage theft, go bankrupt, or die. In contrast, those who went through the regularization process could actually change jobs with their employer's permission and by going through a series of bureaucratic hoops. And I should say this wasn't necessarily easy, but there were fewer restrictions. Those going through the MOU process were also barred from bringing family members with them because it wasn't part of the MOU agreement. There were other things Rati had issues with. While his safe migration speech encouraged migrants to call recruitment agencies and ask about their rates and use that information to make informed decisions, he knew that recruitment agencies weren't welcoming of these questions nor necessarily honest in their responses. He was also required to tell migrants that overseas passports from the Ministry of Labor were free, but he knew this wasn't the case in practice. He was never able to state any of these concerns. Everything he said as part of the MAX program had to be vetted by higher-ups, including, he thinks, the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training. This also meant that if something changed on the ground, they weren't able to modify their script. The result was that there were many inaccuracies in the MAX program, even when staff actually had accurate information. Part of what was produced then at the MAC was misinformation. Misinformation which was consistent, however, and that it always privileged the Cambodian government's goals, even when in doing so, it provided incomplete, questionable, and at times inaccurate information to migrants. This isn't an anomaly of the MAC. It's the product of a development intervention that sought to be technical, apolitical, and neutral, like most safe migration programs. Its diagnosis of what made migrants unsafe had to remain politically acceptable to its government partners. It was charged with educating migrants about safe migration, but it had to do so in a way that didn't implicate state policies or practices or legal recruitment agents or Thai employers or the Thai police as primary causes of vulnerability. This left them with only one way to describe safety, something that could be individually achieved by specific acts, careful planning, decision-making, going through the so-called right channels. The falsehoods and omissions of the MAC's programming were just one of the things that staff there ignored. They also ignored how their center became a site of brokerage during Thailand's regularization campaign, where the legal recruitment agents that they lauded as being honest, responsible brokers actually engaged in extra-legal acts. For various reasons, and this is a little complicated, so I'm happy to talk about it later, many Cambodians who wanted to regularize their status during Thailand's 2017-2018 campaign couldn't do so. But because there was demand, employers and brokers facilitated another route, which was described to me as recycling. Here, Cambodian recruitment agencies, the legal ones, certified by the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training, would work with employers and brokers in Thailand to organize a group of Cambodians to be deported through the MAC. They would pick them up there, they would take them into Phnom Penh, apply for passports, start the MOU process, smuggle them back across the border so that they could keep working while their passports were being processed, and then work with them to get redeported back to Phoi Phet to pick up their passports and visas when they were done and help them cross across the border legally, going back into the same job they'd already worked in. Most cases that I heard about, their pay benefits did not change as a result of them acquiring these documents. MAC staff would witness these acts of recycling, but largely ignore what happened before and after migrants moved through their program, willfully oblivious to the extra-legal acts of their recruitment agents they described as honest brokers. In one case, a migrant couple on one of these passport trucks argued with the broker in front of MAC staff, saying they wanted to go home on their own instead of travel with the broker to make a passport. The broker replied, "You're under my responsibility, you have to stay with me." The MAC staff didn't intervene or challenge the authority of the broker. There are a few elements of spectacle here. Passport seekers being counted twice as deported, the MAC becoming a site of brokerage and facilitation of movement when it's working overtly against irregular movement, and then government and NGO actors ceding authority to brokers in this process. And then, of course, there's the feigned ignorance that it's happening at all. The final example I want to describe comes out of another part of the MAC's work. Alongside safe migration education, the MAC was also charged with anti-trafficking work, data collection on exploitation abroad, which was intended to help NGOs identify hotspots of vulnerability, and then also the identification of any potential victims of trafficking. What this looked like in practice was a set of fast-paced data gathering by various actors with varying agendas while the MAC's videos and safe migration education programming were taking place. The Samaritans per staff would use iPad surveys to collect basic information, inadvertently sometimes twice, from everyone who had arrived to determine potential victims of trafficking. International justice mission staff looked for young men traveling alone or those who might have worked in the fishing sector. IOM staff selected randomly a small number of returnees for a longer survey focused on exploitation. The anti-trafficking police asked those who came with brokers to share the phone numbers, identities, and routes used. Most, of course, were totally unwilling to do this. And the immigration police, this is my favorite, would choose someone in the front row, pretend to ask a question, and write down a pretend response while posing for a photo. This happened almost every day. Employers of the other organizations would scan the room for looking for children and young people traveling alone, signs of vulnerability, child labor, abuse, or abduction. They asked follow-up questions to any young people traveling by themselves and to families with children looking for adult-child pairings that looked suspicious. So for every single truck, there were probably, a dozen individuals, all looking for exploitation or instances of exploitation. The final spectacle evident in MAC related to this exercise in data collection and support, and I'd like to highlight it by juxtaposing two individual migrant returns that I saw during my fieldwork there. The first return was of a middle-aged man who I'll call Buna, who'd been caught crossing the border with a broker and sent back by Thai police to the immigration facility. Like many others at the MAC, Buna had been caught during a clandestine crossing back to Cambodia. He wasn't trying to work abroad, he was actually trying to return home. The broker he used made Buna and his group get out of the car when they saw the police, and they left the group in a sugarcane field. The police threatened his group at gunpoint, took their money, and then deported them. So as a result of police extortion, his group arrived at the MAC totally broke. Buna listened to the Safe Migration Program, gave NGO staff the information they asked for, and when the program was finished, he followed the instructions of the village chief, who directed everyone to taxi drivers for particular destinations. The taxis would take them home in groups. But when he went to the Battambang taxi driver, he learned that the taxis weren't free. Returnees had to pay the fare. He told the driver he had no money, and he was taken to the Samaritan's Purse office. A few minutes later, one of the staff members took out a clipboard and began asking additional details about his experience, exploitation he'd had abroad, the kind of work he'd done, and who he traveled with. They also collected personal information, his name, address, and phone number. Buna wasn't aware of it at the time, but he was being documented as a potential victim of trafficking, an act which allowed the NGO to pay for his fare home. There was no budget to pay a returnee's taxi fare unless they were labeled and documented in this way. This, of course, wasn't the way that NGO partners described their way of identifying victims of trafficking, but in practice it was the most common way that they were identified. Samaritan's Purse had a monthly goal of potential victims in trafficking, and I think it's right here. It doesn't actually have the goal filled in, but in other moments I'd seen it filled in, I believe it was 180. So they had this kind of goal, and they tracked the number of potential victims of trafficking that they found each month. With these people designated in this way, they had a budget line to support them with taxi fare home, food, and if they needed a hotel for the night. There weren't other funding sources to support migrants. So anyone who needed money for a taxi fare home, or anyone who knew that if they said they needed money for a taxi fare home that they would get it, was labeled as a potential victim of trafficking. In exchange, these individuals also had to sit through a very enthusiastic rendition of the gospel in the form of a 30-minute-long flip chart book accompanied by a narrative told by the Samaritan staff, but I'll leave aside my comments on that practice today. During his very brief time at the MAC then, Buna was documented both as a deportee and a potential victim of trafficking, despite the fact that neither label was a very good fit. While he may have been forcibly repatriated by the Thai government, he was already on his way home, a choice he made on his own terms. And while he certainly had experienced exploitation abroad, he did not fit the definition of a victim of trafficking, nor did it match his understanding of his experience. In fact, the abuse he was most concerned of at the time was his mistreatment at the hands of Thai police. The label didn't actually concern Buna. The fact that the NGO paid for his fare home was a good thing, and he thought maybe he would get some other benefits by being documented in this way. But the broader impacts of Buna's experiences at the MAC are worth paying attention to. When people like Buna are labeled as trafficking victims, it sustains the idea that irregular migration is inherently unsafe and that trafficking is common. Alongside, it obscures the real reason for his financial insecurity in that moment, extortion by Thai police. The second encounter, and I don't have any photos here, with a man whose name I never learned, took place in the same week. It was around 7 p.m., the end of a relatively quiet day, when a truck arrived at the MAC. A few minutes after the group was seated, I noticed a man whose chair had been separated from the rest of the rows, presumably by him. He had no shoes, no bag, a torn white shirt worn inside out, a large gash on his forehead, and dried blood forming a thick paste near his right eye. Upon further inspection, I realized he had other wounds, one on his leg and one on his elbow. The man initially drew my attention not because of his wounds, but because of his demeanor. He acted as if he was being hunted, with erratic and paranoid body movements. On repeated occasions, he stood up and quickly grasped the back of the cage while staring intently at the direction of the road at the back of the market. It looked as if he was on the lookout for someone chasing him, or maybe that he was hallucinating. I told my research assistant to keep her distance. He was the first person I had seen at the MAC who looked like he might become violent, not because he was behaving aggressively, but because he was deeply frightened and confused, clearly. The NGO staff just stayed away, but the men from the village office, the village chief's office, began asking him questions. His name, where he was from, and whether he was okay. They asked others in the group if anyone knew him, and how he arrived at the immigration facility across the border. No one knew anything, or if they did, they didn't say. The man couldn't say his name or place his hometown, and the only word he spoke in response to these questions was Kampong Tom, the name of a province about 5 hours away. It was the only thing he said at all. As the MAC program began, he stood up to leave several times and was led back to his chair by village officials. It wasn't clear whether the NGO staff found him threatening, but they clearly avoided him. Halfway through the first MAC video, the man approached the gate by the road, said nothing, and one of the village officials opened it for him. Together, the entire MAC staff watched him slowly walk out of the enclosure and down the street. It was already dark, so his figure disappeared quickly into the poorly lit streets of Phoi Phet. I approached one of the IOM staff, asking if he knew why the man was allowed to leave when he clearly needed assistance. He responded that there was nothing the MAC could do for him. Because he didn't know where he was from, they couldn't put him in a taxi home. And because he couldn't be identified, he couldn't be assisted. I openly expressed my disapproval, noting that he seemed to very clearly fit the definition of someone in need of assistance. About 20 minutes later, just as the taxis were called and the program ended, I noticed the man had returned and was sitting on a bamboo platform just outside the MAC's enclosure. I was told by local officials that someone went to him to bring him back, and by a MAC employee that he'd returned on his own. It wasn't clear to me whether his return had anything to do with my comment or my presence, but whatever the cause, after his return, the staff were newly interested in supporting something. They gathered to determine the next course of action. Someone suggested taking a photo and putting it on Facebook, posting that there was a missing person. This was deemed to be an unlikely solution, which led to the next question. What was to be done about the man, and who was to do it? Questions of responsibility, ownership, and cooperation were constant at the MAC. The space was shared by a half-dozen NGOs, international organizations, and government partners, making it a classic site for turf battles. There were heated discussions of the placement of TVs, the use of specific videos, survey data collection and sharing, who spoke first or at all during the return program, who received information about potential victims of trafficking who arrived outside of normal working hours, and how responsibilities were divided. In every turf battle I observed or learned about, organizations fought for more, not less, ownership. Except for the man. No one wanted to be responsible for a bleeding man. As a starting point, the group determined that the IOM team should clean his wounds, and they began to do so. There were more cuts than we'd initially seen, and they began prodding the largest gash to see if there was any debris or glass in the cut. As they did, the bleeding man passed out and became listless. He shook and twisted violently, but his eyes remained closed. It wasn't clear how conscious he was of us or our conversation. After he was bandaged up, a more intensive conversation began among the staff. There was discussion of letting him sleep inside the enclosure, which seemed to be the default solution. The other options all posed challenges. There was a shelter for vulnerable migrants in Phoi Phet, but according to MAC staff, it was only for women and children, and he wouldn't be able to stay there even for the night. The hospital was an option, but it would cost money, and there was no budget for these costs with any of the organizations. On paper, the IOM had an agreement with the local hospital to ensure that vulnerable returnees would be sent there and treated free of charge, but the agreement didn't work in practice. The hospital staff scolded the MAC staff for bringing people in and using the free service. Plus, even if they agreed to treat him for free, the hospital didn't provide food, water, or have staff to attend to the basic needs of patients. Someone would have to stay with him, and this wasn't something that they were prepared or budgeted for either. After nearly an hour of debate, and I was vociferously included in this debate advocating for the hospital, the group came to the consensus to take him there. 3 hours after he arrived, they wrapped him in a blanket, hefted him to a tuk-tuk, and with a Samaritan's volunteer, they drove him off into the night. Comparing the situation of these two men is instructive in trying to understand what NGOs and international organizations can do in their safe migration programming. Buno just needed money to get home, but he could only be offered that if his experience was categorized as a sensationalized one of potential human trafficking. The bleeding man needed medical and likely psychological care and clearly fit the description of a vulnerable person. Yet not only was he initially left to leave the facility unsupported, he was decidedly not identified as a potential victim of trafficking because he couldn't be supported in the only way that NGOs support this group, collecting information and paying for his fare home. Juxtaposing these two cases, both of young men in need of assistance, the MAC emerges as a site of spectacular intervention in safe migration, one which creates a visually striking image of deportation and victimization among people whose experiences do not fit this image, alongside a failure to adequately support the complex care needs of those who truly do need assistance, because their needs can't be mapped onto fixed project budgets and resources. So what are we to make out of the MAC and its efforts to engender safe migration, and how might this speak to other cases of safe migration? Clearly at the MAC, little is what it appears. Deportees are conjured out of willing returnees and passport seekers. Legal brokers, described as honest, trusted agents, engage in extra-legal acts. The most likely victims of exploitation are only begrudgingly given assistance, and an array of non-vulnerable but cashless people are treated as victims of trafficking. Together, I use these absurdities to argue that the MAC's intervention in safe migration is largely spectacular, offering visually striking performances of care which can be shared with donors to demonstrate success, and we only have to look at this nice chart of how many people have been served to see that. While the products of their work are not particularly likely to engender migrant safety. They do something else, however. The primary achievement of the MAC, I argue, is discursive. It promotes, disseminates, and bolsters a discourse of safe migration that equates safety with a particular form of state-sanctioned movement, even when these claims are at best contestable. In doing so, the MAC serves the interests of states more than it serves the interests of migrants. The other primary achievement of the MAC is the artificial construction of particular categories of migrants, in particular deportees and victims of trafficking. Whether these practices are deliberate or not produces the same result, a sensationalization of the perils of undocumented movement alongside a justification for even more intervention. The spectacle of care is made more apparent by the moments where the MAC's actors appear unwilling or unable to provide care, the encounter with the bleeding man or migrants needing help with regularization processes as an example. As these encounters suggest, while the MAC believes that in providing order it can foster safety, its technocratic approach to addressing problems leaves it little ability to deal with the real vulnerabilities migrants face. For those of us who study development, the MAC's programs are a clear example of what Tanya Lee calls rendering technical, oversimplifying complex socio-political processes into a set of problems that can be solved through the kinds of technical, apolitical development fixes that organizations can offer. We see this in two ways. First, in safe migration education, where the problem of vulnerability in migrant lives is turned into one of poor decisions and the failure to move through the right channels. Second, we see this kind of rendering technical in the direct support the MAC offers to vulnerable migrants, where vulnerability can only be the product of a particular form of exploitation, trafficking, and should only require a particular intervention, assistance returning home. In arguing that this is a site of spectacle, I should note that I'm not intending to minimize the small but meaningful acts of care that are produced at the MAC and places like it. At the MAC, there's basic medical care available and it's often used. Many people benefit from the taxi fare home, and sometimes migrants gain new information about how to file grievances or connect with migrant advocacy organizations abroad. Like other safe migration programs, there are small benefits the MAC provides to those passing through its care. Yet it's also clear that the MAC does more to legitimize state order than it does to engender migrant care. The claims I've made today around safe migration as spectacle draw on sociological and anthropological critiques of borders and immigration law, particularly the work of Nicholas DeGeneva, who describes who's looking at bordering and immigration law, and he critiques the performative act of immigration and bordering police, arguing that it produces what he calls inclusion through exclusion. Here, DeGeneva argues that the, quote, grandiose gestures of migrant exclusion, so here we're talking about border control and immigration policing and kind of the spectacles that happen around bordering. He argues that those grandiose gestures of exclusion obscure the large-scale recruitment of illegalized migrants as legally vulnerable, precarious, and thus tractable labor. Put more simply, the spectacle of migrant illegality allows for migrants to be incorporated into precarious work while being simultaneously stigmatized as being unwanted, undesirable transgressors. So here the exclusion via border practices is visible and performative, while attention is directed away from the inclusion, the need for migrant labor. Something similar, but I see as opposite, is occurring in safe migration programs. Here, the grandiose gestures, if you will, are of care, concern, and safety. They look progressive. It's a performance of inclusion. Yet in their performances of care and inclusion, spaces like the MAC are promoting misinformation, responsibilizing migrants for their own troubles, producing inaccurate and sensationalized images, and normalizing discourses that conflate safety with regularity, which together, I argue, serve the interest of states in their efforts to control migrant bodies. They serve to justify particular forms of exclusion and unfreedom because they justify costly and highly controlling migration regimes. If the MAC is one of the most visible sites of this spectacle of care, it's certainly not the only one. all the safe migration programs I encountered in Cambodia privilege a view suggesting that safety arises out of inclusion into formal state-sanctioned migration systems, despite the fact that those formal systems are responsible, from my perspective, for many of the indignities, unfreedoms, and costs of migration. It's this mismatch, I argue, that makes safe migration interventions more spectacular than substantive. I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to your questions and comments, and thank you all again for being here.